About 30 years ago, great events reshaped Europe, bringing democracy and freedom to the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. It is my honor and pleasure to discuss this historical legacy with Mr. Mikula Dzurinda, who is the president of the Wilfried Martes Center for European Studies, Prime Minister of Slovakia from 1998 to 2006. Welcome, Mr. Dzurinda.
My big pleasure. Thank you for being invited.
Looking back from today, how do you assess the events of 1989 to 1991 in Europe?
The main feature of that times was a feeling of togetherness, the feeling of unity. Despite different societal heritage, despite the fact that significant part of society was represented by former communists, the other one by former dissidents, it was obvious that there was something uniting us. It was yearning for freedom and belonging to the West. It was evident in that Czechoslovakia, but also in all other countries of the former Soviet bloc, including your country, including Estonia. For me, it was a pure evidence that the common denominator on which the future development could be based existed. Despite the huge and heavy heritage of the past, it was encouraging. There is something which unites us all.
When Slovakia freed from the Soviet bloc, and then Estonia and other countries also regained their independence as democratic states, of course for us was extremely important to integrate politically, economically, in the meaning of values with the old Europe that we were watching on as an example. And then the Central and the Eastern European countries gained the membership. And there was a lot of good, happy feelings in our states and in the other parts of Europe because of that reunification. But if you rate it from the perspective of today, what had become of those values that we saw important when we united with the European Union?
Look, the question is very, very wide. On one side, I have a feeling that the Big Bang in 2004 was to some extent the result of the Western reflection of Yalta 1945, when Europe, we can say, was divided. Well, we were obliged to fulfill economic and political criteria to become the EU member, to implement acquis communautaire. But despite all this complexity, the process of enlargement was very smooth and very quick. I believe it was so mainly due to the broad understanding that we all belonged to the same civilization, to the community of countries sharing identical values at the helm with freedom, responsibility, solidarity, rule of law, and human dignity. And these values, the same values, are crucial and the most important also today. A special attention should be paid to freedom. In the past, we faced the communist ideology. Today, we face not only new forms of populism, nationalism, and extremism, but also a mainstream of progressivism or progressive liberalism that constitutes a threat to freedom. You know, I like modernization. I like internet, artificial intelligence, digitalization. But at the same time, I feel we have to defend our traditions at the helm with universal values. we have to defend our Western civilization, or if we want, our way of life.
Thank you for pointing out the topic of values and traditions. If you look back at that time, 30 years ago, the main political ideologies like liberalism, conservatism, and social democracy, and if you see them now, what really happened? Did they degrade or develop?
It seems to me that socialism is more or less forgotten because it lost competition with capitalism. Planned economy lost competition with free market economy. And because socialism is not attractive, especially for young people, but perception or promotion of conservatism and liberalism in our societies have changed, especially in politics. By my mind, conservatism serves as a revolt against the establishment, in our case, against Brussels. See it in the United Kingdom, I mean Brexit. See it in the United States, I mean Mr. Trump and his revolt. See it today in Italy or in Poland, or in Hungary, in some other countries. Political conservatism is still dealing with traditional values, such as family structure and their protection, social mobility of young families, protection of the small and medium-sized enterprises, but only to some extent, and more rhetorically than in practice. European conservatives have resigned on small taxes, on defense, for example, and on reforms as such. On the other side, the liberals gets more and more progressive and aggressive, trying to prevail and dictate their vision of the world. In this context, I see the role of the European People's Party as the composition of the Christian Democrats, moderate conservatives, and the moderate liberals irreplaceable.
I believe that for especially small countries which extremely value their country and they understand that they are surrounded with big languages and economies, and that's why they must be a bit more defensive than strong big nations. For Estonia, it was also a question of how to still have sovereignty, still keep our culture and language safe, but at the same time be open player with other nations who have different perceptions of the defense of the national culture and language. For your country, is the debate on sovereignty in EU important?
To some extent it is, but maybe not so strongly like in your case, like in case of Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania, because we have, from one side, the same experience with the Soviet Union. On the other side, there are some specificities. So the level of such debate in Slovakia is not so high, I have to admit. On the other side, the point of your question is fundamental. How to shape the EU in the years to come? On one side, I believe that we should be more united when it comes to foreign policy, defense, or basic research, or also in some other areas. Single market, Eurozone, etc., etc. On the other side, the issues of cultural, national, religious identity must remain at the national competence for 100%. There is an instrument, a fantastic instrument, thanks to which it is possible to manage the issues. The name of such instrument is subsidiarity. If we stick to the subsidiarity principle, we will manage Europe and small countries, including Estonia, will be happy. I believe in it. Cultural issues, the issues of national identity, the issues of religious identity must remain at the national competence. Unity in diversity was the main slogan at the beginning, and the very, very clever one.
How do you think why many of those people who with their bare hands were destroying the Berlin Wall or stood in big manifestations for democracy and open Europe, now in many nations and many societies are starting to support as electorate ideas of maximum isolationism and protectionism in general politics and economy also?
Well, usually after crisis, a reform is needed. Let's remember that in 2004, in time of Big Bang, when Estonia, Slovakia, and other 8 countries entered the EU, the time was fantastic. I remember this day in Dublin. Sunny day, can you imagine? Sunny, fantastic day. Everybody was happy. President Chirac, President Kwasniewski, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schroeder, and including me, I was convinced that the sun stays forever. 2004. But already in a few years later, in 2008, the global financial crisis has come. Then in a few years, in 2015, we faced immigration tsunami in Europe. And should that not has been enough, in these times we face a pandemic of COVID-19. So during the last decade, or 12, 13 years, Europe has passed through very serious crises. After such crises, usually reforms are needed, even though the reforms are painful, especially in time of their promotion. This is why reforms are unpopular. And the more population is wealthy, the less politicians lean to reform. The leaders are afraid of people. They prefer to be only elected and then re-elected, not undertake real responsibility. That situation gets more and more complicated and difficult. And such development constitutes a grist on the populists' nails. Populists are coming with catchy promises, requiring just more power. Allow me to say that Mr. Trump represents such a case perfectly. So there is only one way for responsible leaders in the future: to promote courageous reforms at both levels, at the national level, but also at the European level. In these days, we are happy because the conference on the future of Europe has launched. I believe the conference will bring not only new ideas, but also will lead to new leadership and new reforms.
Coming back to historical issues, if it's talking about solidarity, it's also connected with historical legacy, the perception of the 20th century and its totalitarian period in Europe. Half of Europe had experiences with National Socialism and communist regime both. But other half of Europe only with National Socialism and different kinds of fascist regimes. It means that the perception of that period is inside Europe quite different, and it can also give birth to different tensions between the societies. How do you think, 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union, do people in Paris and Rome and Rotterdam still know a bit about the experience of Central and Eastern Europe?
The question is very complicated. To some extent, they understand and they remember. On the other side, when it comes to the day which was mentioned by you, August the 23rd, as you rightly pointed out, it was only 12 or 13 years ago when the European Parliament has decided to mark this day as the Europe Day of Victims of Stalinism and Nazism. The problem, by my mind, is not maybe on the side of older countries, as you mentioned in Paris or in Berlin. In Berlin, maybe to some extent, because a part of Berlin belonged to the West after the World War II. The problem is more on our side, on the side of our countries, because there is still a significant number of former communists in politics, in public life. And these people are not seldom reluctant or hesitant to accept that communism was also a criminal and inhuman regime, which needs to be rejected forever, similarly as Nazism. But I believe that time and perseverance of all European freedom fighters will help in this respect. And this is, by the way, why I am so happy and glad that our Estonian friends are dealing with the issue very consistently. I regard this as a very, very important initiative. In Slovakia, my successor was a member of the Communist Party. My successor, can you imagine? So for these people, it is difficult to accept that this regime they served to which was also criminal and heavily inhuman one.
A bit also about the European foreign policy. Well, experts were talking for the last maybe even 10 years that relations between Europe and America are cooling. And it could also endanger smaller states on the periphery, especially those which have border with Russia. How do you feel that this cooling of the transatlantic relations, is it just a thing that comes and goes because we had periods like this in the past, or now it is time to understand that Europe is much more by its own than in the past?
Yeah, a good question. A bit complicated, but very topical also in these days when Mr. President Biden is coming to Europe. Look, I realize, thanks to NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization in general, and the US engagement in particular, we enjoy peace in Europe since the end of the World War II. But another fact is that during the last decade, the global political landscape has changed dramatically, especially due to monumental economic, technological, but also military development in China. I strongly believe in the future of NATO and the role of NATO and the United States in our European security for the decades to come. But we have to realize that the United States must pay a growing attention to China and the Pacific, and that the capacities of the United States are not unlimited, even though the country is very strong. In other words, the EU must slowly but surely shoulder more and more responsibility for its security. You are right with your question to some extent. You have been using the word cooling of relations. To some extent, it happened in time of Mr. Trump, who ignored transatlantic cooperation to some extent, and he ignored multilateralism completely. But it was more or less an episode. I believe that the US realizes as well that transatlantic link must be kept, but they rely on bigger capacity, operability, and ability of the EU to respond to regional challenges. Challenges coming especially from our neighborhood. It is evident also in these days for Biden and his administration, China is priority number one. They would be very happy to leave Russia with all difficulties around in the hands of the EU. It doesn't mean that the US resigned on NATO. It doesn't mean that the US doesn't understand anymore the threat of Russia. It does. But time is coming that the EU must show much stronger, much bigger responsibility and leadership, not only when it comes to soft power, but also when it comes to hard power, when it comes to our European defense.
The foreign policy of the European Union is something that really little number of people really understands. How do you think, is it in the interest of the European nations to give more power to the foreign department of the European Commission and really name some sub-minister of foreign affairs, because at the moment the high representative that we have is ambivalent.
Another fantastic question. Congratulations, you are very, very right. Look, I will be very frank and open. During the last a few years, I'm getting more and more nervous. I believe you remember, as I remember, the last visit of Joseph Borrell to Moscow. He was heavily humiliated by Lavrov. You remember the visit of Madame von der Leyen in Ankara a few weeks ago. She was heavily humiliated by Erdogan. And I would continue with aggressiveness of China and our inability to respond properly. I would use another term. Europe is becoming more and more irrelevant. And this is not good. The question is, why? I offer my answer. This is why, because we are unable to speak with one voice when it comes to foreign policy agenda. What does it mean to be able to speak with one voice? It means that decisions should be taken swiftly, not within a few weeks or a month, with many infinite discussions. It means that we desperately need to change our decision making, to shift the method of the decision making from unanimity to the qualified majority vote. We launched our debate, Sergei, with your question about culture, identity, national identity, regional identity. I was advocating strongly for the sovereignty of the member states. And I was dealing a bit with the principle of subsidiarity. We should stick to this principle, not only when it is advantageous for national states, but also when it is needed to keep Europe relevant and strong. Having said this, I strongly advocate for the change of the decision making and to apply qualified majority vote. Sometimes Germany will win. Sometimes France will win. Sometimes smaller countries will win. We will build different coalitions when it comes to the vote. But everybody will know that at the end of the day, if there is no unanimity, we will decide by qualified majority vote. It is crucial also for security, for defense, for our perception in the world.
Since we are slowly heading towards the end of our conversation, I have one or two a bit more personal questions, if I may.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
30 years ago, your dreams, personal dreams about your life and your society, did they really come true now?
The issue is strictly individual, depending on many factors, many attributes. If I want to make a joke, I would say the yes, because at the end I became the prime minister of my country.
Right.
But the issue is completely different. Look, if I am meeting people, if I am watching around, one thing is evident. When it comes to material, it means economic and social development, there is no doubt. We can be satisfied. I visited Estonia a few times by the way, the last visit before the pandemic, it was Stalin. I spent 2 fantastic days there. And the city is so beautiful. Our villages, our countryside is so beautiful. I have to admit that the speed of economic convergence in the EU is slow. But at the same time, I say this is our fault. This is our unwillingness to promote reform, such as Mart Laar did in Estonia, or my government, 2 governments, did in Slovakia. But despite this fact that the economic convergence in the EU is slow, the figures are clear. The Eastern and Central European countries are catching up with the most developed countries in Europe. Slowly, but surely. The problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, we face new challenges, unexpected challenges, and it sometimes creates a picture that if we stay independent or if we isolate ourselves, maybe the pressure on immigrants or the pressure for harmonization or something like that would be much less, but it is just an illusion. So, going right to your question, I am very happy, sir. I remember communism. In 1989, I was 35. My father was not allowed to teach, even though he was the director of the school before communism came. My mother the same. So I know what does it mean, persecution. What does it mean if people are not equal? I know what does it mean if my father told me, hey, guy, you should go to the church, but only during night, and nobody should see you. Otherwise, you will face difficulties at the university. So I remember very well these times. Long story short, I am happy and proud. Thanks God, we joined the EU and the West.
And the last short question. By coincidence, I was born on 20th of August 1991, the same day when Estonia regained its independence. What would be your general message to Europeans of my generation?
Think as Estonians, but more and more also as Europeans. The clock is ticking. Globalization is impossible to stop. The threats are living, but also emerging. And your future is not only in your hands, it is, but it is also in your capability to distinguish what has the future and what is short-sighted. This is my message. You know, it is very difficult to look or to find out the paradise in the world. It is very difficult. But what is possible is to be active, to take good education, to work hard, and to think in a horizon not only of a few years, but also of a few decades. I strongly believe in Western civilization. I strongly believe in European togetherness. Not everything is perfect, but in free world, there is a fantastic thing. You can take initiative. Nobody invited me to join the politics. Nobody came to me telling Mr. Dzurinda, you will be the prime minister of the country. It was my decision that I want to change my country. I want to bring the country to the civilized world. And this is a real value. So my message is be active. Don't shy off politics. Jump into politics. If you are young, this is also a kind of your obligation.
Mr. Dzurinda, I'm extremely thankful for this conversation. I must say personally that you project hope and extremely positive energy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All the best to you and to your fantastic country.
Thank you very much.